Welcome to our first webinar of the new year, which is strange to say in October, but that is our schedule, and that's how we roll here with our lead and epic grants. So tonight we are joined by Marcella Micucci, and she is the executive director of the Oneonta Historical Society in Oneonta, New York. And she is an expert in women's history. So we are excited that she is joining us to talk about women of the Revolution. Some of her exhibitions and work have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. I am Shauna with NCHE. If you don't know me already, I am an education coordinator, and I'm here tonight with my colleague Kathleen in Michigan, who is also an education coordinator with NCHE. So just a couple of reminders. We'd love for you to chat in the chat area. If you do have a question, please leave that in the Q&A area. That way Marcella can see those easily, and we will answer those at the end. If you are just coming in, go ahead and change in the chat area. There's a blue little button at the bottom right-hand corner of the chat. Change that to everyone so we can all see your comments. It's defaulted for some reason to hosts and panelists, but we want you all to participate in the discussion tonight. So without further ado, I am going to pass it over to Marcella.
Thank you so much for having me. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be kicking things off. That was a fantastic introduction, so I don't think I need to give a whole lot of additional information. But I will say that I'm excited for tonight's presentation. This has been one that I used to give daily when I was at the Museum of the American Revolution. And it's been a couple years now since I really got to actively give this presentation. So I am quite excited about it. So give me just one moment. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get started. All right. Can I get just a thumbs up from everyone that you can see before I get started? We good to go? Everyone can see the screen? All right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so on July 4th, 1776, the American Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, announcing that all men are created equal. But the question of the night is, what did this mean for women? Did it actually mean equality for them too? And I think a lot of you already know the answer to this, but we're going to talk about it tonight. So yes, the American Revolution did provide inroads for women socially, politically, economically, culturally. But we first have to ask, which women? Would these inroads apply to poor women, married women, Black women, Native American women? Women were not a monolith. I know that the topic of this talk is women in politics in the early republic, but there was a diverse array of experiences amongst women, not only in the American Revolution, but particularly in the early republic as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. But nevertheless, we can point to women's political participation in early America as a turning point for women's rights, or dare I even say, an early women's rights movement. This movement began over 50 years before the traditional suffrage movement. A lot of people obviously will point to Seneca Falls, 1848, and nearly a century before that, women were being very politically active, particularly before women started voting in Western states, and that will come into play in just a little bit. In fact, women's political activism in the early republic is what laid the groundwork for the suffrage and the reform movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. The push for women's rights began in the early republic. It began after the revolution, when the promise of equality, that promise of 1776, provided the foundation for women and free people of color to push for their rights. And in places like New Jersey, this even resulted in them gaining the right to vote. But before we get to those rights, we have to look back to women's status in the British American colonies before the Revolution. When men had advantages over women, obviously, generally a married woman's property belonged to her husband. For example, This was based in an English common law principle called coverture. But even before the war, in the old world of monarchy and hierarchy, some women stepped into powerful roles, whether in their communities, in their households, or even as queens and leaders of their country. And women born into royal families who had property could wield a lot of power. Property ownership could trump gender in determining a person's social rank. We see that with women like Queen Anne, who ruled England, Scotland, and Ireland as separate kingdoms from 1702 to 1707, or Queen Charlotte, who married the King of Great Britain, George III, in 1761. As part of the royal family, she was the top of the social hierarchy of Great Britain and Ireland during the American Revolution. Or Hannah Callowell Penn, the wife of William Penn and acting proprietor or colonial governor of Pennsylvania from 1718 to 1726 following his death. So once the American Revolution was underway, women once again stepped into new and often powerful roles. The revolution changed women's lives. It opened opportunities for women who capitalized on the changes wrought by the disruption of the American Revolution and the inroads the war provided for women and their political, social, cultural, and economic status. Some of these women you might know. These pictures might look familiar to you. Women like Mercy Otis Warren, Phyllis Wheatley, Esther Reed, Elizabeth Willing Powell, Elizabeth Freeman. Some of these women even gained the title of, quote, female politician. Esther DeBurgh Reed, for example, was the First Lady of Pennsylvania and the wife of Governor Joseph Reed. In 1780, she founded the Ladies Association of Philadelphia. Her work inspired women in other states, like New Jersey, to lead local relief efforts to raise funds for the Continental Army. This is a good quote by her that you see on the bottom of the screen. To march to glory by the same paths as men, we should at least equal and sometimes surpass them in our love for the public good. She wrote this in 1780. We also see Mercy Otis Warren, author, female politician, historian, playwright, and activist, one of my personal favorites. She often voiced her political views and her support for the revolution in her writing, and actually published The History of the American Revolution, one of the first histories of the revolution, and also one of the first publications by a woman. We also see Phyllis Wheatley here on the screen, African-American poet who published poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in 1773, the first published book of poetry by an African-American woman. Women also took an active role in the resistance movement to British rule in the 1760s and 1770s. They organized boycotts of imported products and chose American-made goods. They printed broadsides or posters like the one that you see here from 1770, targeting Bostonian William Jackson and asking the Daughters of Liberty, or groups like this one that favored American rights, to boycott his shop because he imported British goods. Sometimes the Daughters of Liberty also joined the Sons of Liberty, who I'm sure you've heard of, to threaten merchants who refused to participate in boycotts. They held spinning bees, in which they used spinning wheels and tape looms to create American-made fabrics called homespun to protest British policies. Women's role in these boycotts made some women resent the limits that the colonial laws placed on women to own property or to act politically. Other women provided essential support to the army during the war, living as camp followers, working as iron and cartridge makers, printers, bookbinders, household producers and consumers, fundraisers, writers, and influencers. These laborers and producers turned their domestic tasks into patriotic acts. Some, of course, remained on the home front, caring for the family, managing the household, while others took roles as producers and suppliers of the war effort. These women provided important support for information throughout the war, and their stories speak to American women's ability to contribute to the revolution without openly challenging expected gender roles of the time. Some women, however, did just that, and a few even served as soldiers and spies. Although women were not able to join the military during the American Revolution, at least a few women disguised as men did serve as secret soldiers. And one of these women was Deborah Sampson. who disguised herself as a soldier and enlisted in the Massachusetts 4th Regiment of the Continental Army in 1782. Eventually, a surgeon treating Sampson for wounds identified her as female, and she was on early discharge. And after the war, she goes on to marry. She marries Benjamin Gannett in 1785, and actually the dress that you see here on your screen is the one that she wore on her wedding day. That is in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. In 1797, she published an autobiography, The Female Review, largely focused on her military stories. She went on a speaking tour and performed military maneuvers on stage, sometimes in uniform. And her book and tour carefully navigated the line between celebrating her service and reassuring readers and her audience of her proper gender behavior. In 1805, Sampson became one of the only women to receive a pension for her service. And her story mirrors those of other women who attempted to fight during the war, some who you may have heard, the legends of people like Molly Pitcher, for example. Enslaved women also began questioning their status in the new nation as a result of the American Revolution. One of those women was Elizabeth Freeman, or Mumbette, who lived as an enslaved woman in Massachusetts. And after hearing the Massachusetts Constitution being read aloud in her master's home, Freeman sought out Theodore Sedgwick, a lawyer and anti-slavery advocate in Massachusetts, that helped her sue for her freedom as an inhabitant of the state. In 1781, Freeman won her freedom in court. Her case helped set a precedent prohibiting slavery in the state of Massachusetts. And this quote, I mean, I just live for this quote. She wrote, "At any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told that I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it just to stand 1 minute on God's earth as a free woman." And she did just that. And after winning her freedom, Freeman remained employed in the home of her lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, for the remainder of her life. In fact, she was even buried in their family plot known as Sedgwick Pie in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And this portrait itself, I think, is even telling because it was painted by Susan Ann Livingston Ridley Sedgwick. I know that's a mouthful, but she was the daughter of Catherine Livingston Ridley and granddaughter of New Jersey Governor William Livingston. But of course, the best known of these women, I'm sure, is Abigail Adams, and for good reason, who in 1776 wrote a now famous letter to her husband, John, urging him to, quote, remember the ladies. And I will also say, when we had our exhibition, When Women Lost the Vote at the Museum of the American Revolution, I had the extreme privilege of being able to not only Massachusetts Historical Society didn't even only agree to loan this letter, but I actually got to go to their historical society, see and touch this letter in person. I mean, talk about like historian dreams come true. That was one of them. But in this letter, Adams questions women's place in the new code of laws. But what's most interesting is the dialogue that actually surrounds this letter, because John, when he writes back, he completely dismisses her. He calls her saucy. He says, quote, "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems." And Abigail, aggravated, does, what any woman would do in any time or place. So before she writes back to John, she writes a letter to her closest friend and confidant, one of my favorites again, Mercy Otis Warren, also in Massachusetts, and tells her, "I can't believe he said that to me. We should petition Congress." And while we don't know if or what Warren wrote back to Abigail, we do know that it takes about 10 days. She sits on it 10 days, and then she writes back to John. And this, I think, is, what's really telling. She writes back to him and she says, quote, "But you must remember that arbitrary powers, like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet." I mean, this is like the prime, like proverbial mic drop moment for Abigail, right? John, of course, still dismisses her, but this is a huge thing. She's taking a stand not only against her husband, but someone who is in a position of great political power. And her correspondence with her husband suggests that she wasn't just advocating for women's rights to representation in government. She was also pushing for more property rights and other legal protections for wives within marriage. And while these letters, of course, were kept private, they key into a crucial moment of the American Revolution when women's status and citizenship was being questioned. But of course, women were not the only ones that were questioning this status. And in 1776, the New Jersey state constitution did not exclude inhabitants from the vote based on race or gender. Instead, it used the gender-neutral term they in its section on voter eligibility. Voters need only possess property worth, quote, 50 pounds proclamation money clear estate. It's likely that legislatures assumed that this would exclude most women and people of color, but it had created an opening. In 1790, New Jersey went on to become the first and only state to explicitly enfranchise women by describing voters as, quote, he or she in the new election law. When I was at MOAR, we used to call this the revolutionary she. This initially applied to only 7 of the 13 counties in New Jersey, but in 1797, this law goes statewide. And additionally, in 1797, the election law retained the property qualification, but excluded the term clear estate. In other words, basically, this meant that proof of property ownership did not have to be in the form of things like real estate, for instance. But which women could vote? Property ownership was a prerequisite for political participation in most states in the 1700s. So the question really becomes which women were entitled to own property. Married women and indentured servants, for instance, could not typically own property under English common law, as we discussed earlier. Married women could not vote because of a set of legal principles under English common law called femme coverture. Yes, a French term for in English common law, which determined that married women were the economic dependents of their husbands. This implied that a woman's legal covering after marriage meant that her husband subsumed her legal and political rights, i.e., her right to own property. Similarly, enslaved African Americans who were considered at this time property and not persons were legally barred from property ownership. Many of these groups were thus considered, obviously, ineligible to vote. Because it was harder for women to own property, it was believed that fewer women were able to meet the property requirement and vote, particularly in states like New Jersey. But, and this is very important, not all women were wives. Many wives outlived their husbands and never remarried, and some women never married at all. These women of another French term, femme sole status, were the only women in early America that were legally permitted to own property free of male control. So in places like New Jersey, it seems likely that these women could have shown up to the polls willing and able to demonstrate their ownership of property. And this property could include real estate, or it could include other movable property, things like the clothing or jewelry that she wore, her possession perhaps of livestock, or even perhaps the possession of enslaved people. So I know what you're wondering, could married women vote? And the answer to this is clear, technically by law, no. However, some were, in the same way that women are today, able to maneuver around coverture restrictions, prenuptial agreements, marital settlements, deeds of gift, trusteeships. All of these were set in place to protect married women's property that they brought into a marriage. These women had what Abigail Adams once referred to in her correspondence as money or property that, quote, I call my own, even if the actual legal ownership of that property was unclear. Other women, of course, may have taken advantage of the fact that elections were very loosely regulated in the 18th century and tried to vote despite these restrictions. And still others particularly like women of color, may not have had marriages at that time that were recognized by the state, creating a loophole that may have allowed them to own property. So we know if women can vote, but did women vote? Most evidence of women voting has been largely anecdotal, sources like newspaper accounts referring to women voting, but there's little primary source evidence of women actually casting ballots. This newspaper article, for example, that you see on the screen, is from a paper, The Bee, in 1797. It reports, in Elizabethtown, the federal ladies, maids, as well as matrons, believers in the democratic Wollstonecraft's rights of women, turned out in support of their favorite candidates and gave their votes to the number of 75 heads. I also really love the shout out to Mary Wollstonecraft, which we will talk about in just a couple minutes. Okay, so we know if they could, we know in theory they did, but it wasn't until just recently that we found the evidence to confirm that yes, women were voting. So in 2018, when I was working at MOAR, we discovered 9 poll lists that identify 163 women voters and at least 4 free voters of color that were voting in elections from 1800 to 1807 in county, state, and federal elections across the state of New Jersey. I mean, this is like groundbreaking research, not just for me as a historian and for the exhibition I was working on, but I mean, really, this just completely changes women's history as we know it in the early republic. These lists prove that women were not only voting, and sometimes in large numbers, but that they were active participants in the political process that shaped the new nation, and not merely passive witnesses and bystanders, as many have assumed that they were. They are an entry point into the unknown lives and experiences and of the first generation of women voters in the United States. These poll lists shed light on women of all classes, backgrounds, and possibly races, allowing us to trace their history of property ownership, marital status, religion, political affiliation. I mean, this list goes really on and on. I mean, if anyone is interested in this, I do urge you to go to the Museum of the American Revolution website. If you go to Learn and Explore, the online exhibit for When Women Lost the Vote is on there. You can click on it. You can actually go and you can look at these poll lists. You can zoom in, you can read the names on them. We've done genealogical research on a lot of these women, so you can actually click on their name. You can learn about their family. You can learn about who they voted with, when they got married, if they got married, what property they owned, where they lived, what church they went to. I mean, really, this is just such a fantastic resource, particularly for teachers. And a great research tool as well for any historian, particularly anyone that studies women's history. But I mean, even if you look here on these lists, and I've highlighted some of the names of the women here so that you can find them a little bit easier, they reveal women's voting patterns. For instance, women voting in large groups or alongside their friends or their male and female family members. One group in particular on the list that you see on your left-hand side on the middle column, Grace Little, Lydia Stott, Mary Norris, Hetty Gaw. We find all 4 of those women also on the list for the Presbyterian Church in their neighborhood. So clearly these women were friends, they were together, they had a social relationship, and they didn't just go to church together, they went to vote together. And, this is just really incredible. 2 of those women I know that I can recall, I know that they were widows, so they never remarried. And oftentimes, as we just discussed, as a widow, you in many cases would be able to have retained at least a piece of the property from your marriage, which would have likely made these women eligible to vote or to meet the property requirement to vote in New Jersey. But again, they give us this kind of glimpse into all these women's lives. They introduce us to women like Martha Githens, who is one of the only voters so far that we've been able to locate a portrait of. She voted in 1807 in Chester Township in Burlington County, New Jersey. And this is just 1 month before the state legislature would overturn the election statute, which happened in November of 1807, that would repeal the vote for women. So Githens voted as a single woman. She voted with her sister, Rebecca Githens, their father, George Githens, her older brother, Alanson Githens. Both Martha and Rebecca were unmarried. They were over 21 years of age in 1807. Their two older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were married, so we don't see them turn up on the poll list. And their three younger sisters were not old enough to vote. They weren't yet 21. But we do see these two sisters going and voting together with their brother and their dad. And this is her portrait miniature painted by Raphael Peale in 1805, just 2 years actually before she voted. So she would have looked very similar to this when she was going to the polls. And I mean, also, let's just look at her. Look how modern she looks. She has like hoop earrings and like swept back hair. I mean, I feel like this could be like the coolest woman walking down the streets of, you know, like Manhattan today. Just like so super cool. But she had this miniature painted as actually an engagement present for her fiance, Jacob Rowan of Haddonfield, New Jersey, who actually, unfortunately, died. He drowned shortly before their wedding. So they were never married, and she never marries after that. So she remains single for the rest of her life. And she gifted this miniature to her sister Margaret in her will in 1825. And this went through the hands of private collectors for many, many, many years. So this was quite a find when we were able to find this portrait. Again, the only existing portrait that we know of so far for one of the voters that we've identified on these poll lists. But women around the nation took note of the New Jersey example. They drew inspiration from what some historians refer to as, quote, the New Jersey exception and its early women voters. Again, even Abigail Adams knew about and referenced New Jersey women voters in a letter that she wrote to her sister in 1797. She wrote, quote, if our state constitution in Massachusetts had been equally liberal with that of New Jersey and had admitted the females to vote, I should certainly have exercised it on his behalf. And this was talking about she was talking about a local election, obviously, that she was barred from participating in because she was living in Massachusetts. We also see John Adams, her husband, recalling a story to his grandson in which Eleanor, otherwise known as Nellie Park Custis, allegedly rides on horseback in 1797 to her local polling place in Virginia to attempt to vote as a freeholder. If you don't know Nellie Park Custis, she was Martha and George Washington's granddaughter. So she ends up settling in Mount Vernon permanently in 1799 when she marries Washington's nephew, Lawrence Lewis. But even in Massachusetts and even in Virginia, we have women that are saying, you know, well, I would have, you know, I want to vote. I'm a freeholder. I'm a property owner. I should be able to vote. Or, you know, just saying that if I had that right in the state that I live in, I certainly would have exercised it. But women voting in New Jersey was one of the many symptoms of a national phenomenon, one that was influencing and influenced by revolutionary ideology and talk of women's rights in the States and also across the Atlantic. This new kind of women's rights talk emerged in the 1790s, and along with it, a new generation of women activists, intellectuals, educators, politicians. These women pushed gender boundaries and advocated for equal rights for women in Europe and in America. An upsurge in women's publishing in the post-revolutionary era also accompanied a call for women's rights and inspired a dialogue between some of these women activists. While white, middle, and upper-class women, of course, were among the most vocal and visible advocates for equality of the sexes in the early republic, they were not alone. Women of color, and some men too, also voiced their support for women's equal opportunities, especially in education. So let's meet some of these fantastic people that we see on the screen here. So from the top left and over, I feel like this woman needs no introduction, but this is Mary Wollstonecraft. She published one of the most groundbreaking feminist treatises, Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792. The 92 date is important, as you will learn in just a moment. Next to her in the center at the top, we have Dorena Lee. Dorena Lee grew up in Cape May, New Jersey. She was a preacher, despite being barred from the profession as a woman. Her sermons were so powerful that she became the first female preacher of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And in 1836, she actually publishes her own autobiography. Next to her in the corner on the right-hand side, we have Judith Sargent Murray, another one of my favorites. one of the most prominent proponents for women's equality and female education in the early republic in the United States. One of her first essays promoting women's rights, called On the Equality of the Sexes, published in 1790, predates even Wollstonecraft's vindication. So I think everyone kind of thinks of Mary Wollstonecraft as kind of pushing, she's the precipice, she's the one that is kind of starting this movement in the, across the Atlantic, when in reality, 2 years before that, we have Judith Sargent Murray sitting home and writing, on the equality of the sexes. And she goes on to continue to publish egalitarian tracts in the 19th century, including probably most well-known, The Gleaner in 1798. And then she goes on to open a ladies' academy outside of Boston in 1802. So she's like all about the ladies. Down at the bottom on the left-hand side, we have Annis Boudinot Stockton. She was among the new nation's first published poets and was a notable supporter of the American Revolution. Annis and her husband, who was a Declaration of Independence signer, Richard Stockton, often hosted other leading revolutionaries, including Martha and George Washington, at their home Morven in Princeton, New Jersey. This is actually a museum today in Princeton. If you haven't been, I urge you to go. It's absolutely beautiful. The grounds are fantastic. But when Stockton's husband fell ill and died in 1781, she became a widow of femme sole status. She never remarried, and that would have theoretically, because she was in New Jersey, made her eligible to vote in the state. But she did also, of course, in much of her writing and her private correspondence, reference Wollstonecraft's writing, and was a major proponent of women's rights. In the middle here at the bottom, we have Susanna Rowson, whose first publication, Charlotte Temple, published in 1794, though at the time published anonymously, became America's first best-selling novel, male, female, across the board, and launched her literary career. That same year, Susanna Rowson opened Slaves in Algiers in Philadelphia. This was a critically acclaimed play that basically solidified her reputation as an advocate for women's rights. And that is because Rowson personally delivered the epilogue for this play. She went out on stage and she said, quote, "Women were born for universal sway, men to adore, be silent and obey." And this is another proverbial mic drop moment for Susanna Rowson. She got slammed in the press for this, but she didn't care at all. She just kept it going. She's, a personal idol of mine. And very similar to Judith Sargent Murray, she goes on to open a young ladies' academy in Boston in 1797. And then last, but certainly not least, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have Elias Boudinot. Elias Boudinot was a lawyer and a member of the original Continental Congress. He was also the brother of Annis Boudinot Stockton. He represented New Jersey in the House of Representatives from 1789 to 1795. As an advocate for women's rights in 1793, Boudinot led a Federalist campaign to politicize women. Love that. He says, quote, "The rights of women are no longer strange sounds to an American ear, and I devoutly hope the day is not far distant when we shall find them dignifying in a distinguishing code the jurisprudence of several states of the Union." He wrote this in 1793. This is incredibly important at this moment in time in 1793, because this is right around the time in New Jersey when a lot of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are both vying for women's votes. So he goes on this Federalist campaign. He's trying to politicize women. And you'll see why that is so important when we get to our next slide. So the 1790s and early 1800s, they seem to be a really progressive moment for women, especially in New Jersey, right? So we have to ask the question of the night: what happened? In New Jersey, the state stripped the vote from women and free people of color in 1807 and redefined the electorate as free, white, male taxpayers. Legislatures cited voter fraud as their reasoning for doing so. Accusations of voter fraud culminated in 1806 when thousands more votes for an election in Essex County, New Jersey, were cast than there were voters. And this was one of many accusations of voter fraud from pretty much the 1790s through 1807. Most of the claims, and this is the most outrageous part, most of the claims pointed to men that were dressing as women. So they were voting, then they were going and dressing as women and going and voting again. That women that were reportedly ineligible to vote were casting ballots, namely married women. There's some, completely ludicrous accounts in these petitions of voter fraud where they're saying like, oh, the person that was watching the ballot box walked away, and when they did, all the men that were, in the tavern left the tavern and went and pulled women off of carriages and brought them into the polling place and made them cast their ballots, even though they may not have been eligible to vote. Some of these stories are just crazy. And, I think we can all today look back at this moment in time and be like, oh, well, like, are women really to blame here? But they believed that they were. And ultimately, the New Jersey legislature scapegoated not only women, but also people of color and immigrants for all of these problems, and took the steps toward white male suffrage in order to try to remedy them. So basically, we have all these people that are trying to vote that, maybe are ineligible to vote. Why don't we just make it very clear that this isn't just a property restriction, that this isn't gender neutral, that this is white male taxpayers. And it would remain that way in New Jersey and in all of the states until we begin to see the passage of women's suffrage in the Western states in the late 1800s. But women voters especially were the targets in these petitions citing voter fraud. They increasingly became targets in the press and satirical newspaper articles, which referred to them as the Pety Coat electors and Wollstonecraftians. In this dress that you see here, that was on loan, that we had on display at the Museum of the American Revolution from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And this is just a neoclassical gown, something that a woman in the 1790s, early 1800s, a very modern woman may have been wearing when she may have been going to the polls, one of these petticoat electors. And I think that this quote really sums it up perfectly. And this comes from the Sentinel of Freedom, a newspaper from 1798. And it reads, quote, "Although reinforced by the petticoat band, true Republican valor they could not withstand, and of their disasters and triumph will sing, for the petticoat faction's a dangerous thing." Whew, it's harsh. So basically, let me sum this up for you. While the partisan race made New Jersey women, at first, active participants in the political arena, as more women voted and talk of women's rights came to the surface in the 1790s and early 1800s, critics began to satirize women's role in politics. Women voters came to be viewed as a threat and no longer considered to be an attribute to the political system. And this is very telling of the shift that we'll begin to see in the early decades of the 1800s when we kind of transition into the 19th century in the antebellum period, in which women are kind of barred from the political system. But as women were pushed out of the political sphere, and the separate spheres ideology, basically women in the home, men in public and private, men in politics, women in the home. As this begins to take shape in the Victorian era, women activists did not give up. Instead, they shifted their efforts to educational initiatives to prepare the next generation of young girls for future political participation. As was the case with women like Susanna Rowson and Judith Sargent Murray, who we met earlier, many opened schools and female academies, which laid the groundwork for primarily white women, as well as some women of color, educated in these schools to launch what would become the middle-class reform movement of the 19th century. These schools offered girls like Burlington County's Hannah Deacon, whose Globe sampler is pictured here, courses in music, drawing, literature, arithmetic, history. Deacon made this sampler at the Westtown School, a Quaker boarding school in Chester County, Pennsylvania, when she was about 15 or 17 years old. Its detailed craftsmanship suggests that young women's education did include things, like sewing, etc., but it also included a wide variety of subjects, including things like geography. To give you a little bit of kind of reference for size here, this is about the size of a small orange. So it's about this big, and incredibly detailed. It's made of wool, silk, linen. It's all hand stitched. And I mean, this is 1815, 1817 when this sampler was created. So, I mean, even just having the knowledge of geography as it stands at that period in time, let alone coming from a 15 to 17-year-old girl at a Quaker boarding school, I mean, this just goes to show that, these women really were, these young girls really were going to these schools and getting a really deep-seated knowledge of not only the nation, but of the world. And this next class of women would become the next generation of women activists, reformers, suffragists, many of whom would evoke the memory of the American Revolution, the early republic, and even the first women voters in New Jersey, to ground their position in America and its founding and assert their right to equal citizenship. And the most notable example I have of this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I'll end on this because obviously this pushes into the 19th century. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who you may not know, she was a Jersey girl. And in 1880, she actually is at her house with someone else you might know, Susan B. Anthony. They are in the process of working on their history of women's suffrage. And somebody shows up to her house and says, "Hey, it's election day. It's time to come vote. Everyone in the household come to vote." And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's like, "Okay, I'll go vote." And she shows up to the polling place and she never actually casts her ballot. She fills it out. She puts it on top of the ballot box. And she looks at the poll inspector and she says, quote, something along the lines of, "On this sacred soil where we now stand, women voted from 1776 to 1807. And she references the first women voters in New Jersey as a way to set a precedent for why women should have the right to vote in New Jersey when she goes to vote in 1880. And this is just one of so many examples of how these women and their activism and everything that they published and they wrote and did. I mean, this was really laying the groundwork, setting the stage. This is the foundation for what would become the women's rights movement as people think of in this traditional kind of trajectory that begins, in the 19th century. And truth be told, I think that all of these women and their stories are a testament to the fact that this wasn't a movement that started in the 19th century. It may not have even started in the early republic, but we do know that this was a moment in time during the American Revolution and in the years in the early republic following the revolution, that this promise of equality was something that was questioned for these women, and they really fought for these rights and their right to equal citizenship. And it was these women who really served as the example for these women in the next generation in the 19th century. And had they not done that, who knows how can we even say, if any of those reform movements, for instance, temperance, abolition of slavery, suffrage, I mean, who knows if any of those movements would have even really taken place without these kind of foremothers that were kind of laying the groundwork for them. So when people say, the women's rights movements or suffrage or whatever it might be started in the 19th century, now you can all say like, no, actually it did not. This actually really began and took place in this kind of revolutionary ideology, and particularly in these years of the early republic. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I learned so many new things tonight that I did not know. And we do have about 15 minutes for questions. So you can either add those in the Q&A area. If you hover over the bottom part of your computer, you can type in your question there, or you can type it in the chat.
Oh, well, I see a question that I can answer in the chat about the poll lists and the states that they're in. So all of the poll lists that we were able to locate are in the state of New Jersey. They range throughout the entire state. Some of them are found in Salem County. A lot of them actually were found in Montgomery. A lot of the poll lists themselves are for all different elections. So it's not just, a local election. These are state and federal, presidential, even congressional. So these women are actively voting in all these elections. And we have found 9 so far. So again, Jennifer, I would urge you to go to the Museum of the American Revolution website and look up the When Women Lost the Vote online exhibit and go in, and you can see there's scans, full high-res scans. You can even download them of all the poll lists. You can go in, you can see exactly what townships they were for, what years they were for, what elections they were held for. You could see all the names of the women. And again, I mean, this is just an incredible resource for teachers, but also for people like me, who are very excited that we were able to make those public. As far as the archives that we found them in, we did find them at the Salem County Historical Society, and we also found a big chunk of them at the New Jersey State Archives.
All right. Any other questions we can answer? This is so fascinating. I really did not know a lot of this information, and what a great find. Any other questions that we can answer tonight? Okay, I think I've given my 7 seconds of wait time, which I know isn't pure science. But thank you everyone who came to, oh, one more question. I see it, I see it. Can you elaborate on the role that Abigail Adams played?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Abigail Adams was such a force. Let's just say that. I mean, although obviously, as we know, she never held any sort of public office or anything like that. She was, I think, what some historians would refer to as a helpmeet to her husband. I would use a different term. I would call her his chief advisor. He really didn't make any decisions without running them by her. And although he wasn't always willing, especially as we can recall with the Remember the Ladies letter, to take her advice, he was always willing to at least listen to it, which is something that I think was unique to that time. But also, I would say, is something that made John Adams as potentially revolutionary as people characterize him as being. So again, although she, of course, never held any office, she never voted in Massachusetts or any other state, as far as we know. But she was quite an influencer and very influential in not only John Adams' life, but in many of the people that were in his, political party and cabinet. She even has really active correspondence with people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. She was very much involved.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think everyone is going to be rushing to the Museum of the American Revolution, and members who are here tonight that are part of our EPIC grant and our LEAD grant will be visiting this summer. So that is something to look forward to. Any other questions that we can answer before we close out tonight? Yes, and we are a group of mostly women. Fellas, I do see you in there. But I'm looking over the list, so I hope that everyone enjoyed it. This was a fantastic webinar. You will receive an email tomorrow that will confirm your attendance for PD points if you are part of the EPIC grant, or if you are part of LEAD, we already got your attendance, but you will be sent that anyway. So thank you so much. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Our next webinar is on visual thinking strategies from Harvard's Project Zero, and that will be on October 25th. So we hope to see some of you at that webinar, and have a great night.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.